Welcome. Welcome to this presentation about chunks and teaching them. Chunks are groups of words that we use in written and spoken language. But what does the word chunk actually mean? When your soup or pasta sauce is chunky, you can see and chew the chunks of meat. When your chocolate is chunky, you can see largish bits of nuts. When you have chunks of gold, they are about the same size as chunks of meat. Even people can be described as chunky, though it's not very common. From a linguistic point of view, can you imagine what a chunk of language is? Unlike this sample of linguistic terms, chunk derives from neither Greek nor Latin. In fact, etymology online does not hint at where this word might have come from. It sounds Germanic or Old English to me, like church or clump or chunk. Despite not having a noble lineage, the linguistic community has embraced this term. And much ink has been spilt debating definitions and writing up research into the structure of chunks, the frequency of specific chunks, and the proportion of chunks in text generally, which chunks are context specific, how they exist in our minds, how we process them when listening and reading, how we recall them when speaking and writing, and of course, how language teachers can teach them and decide which ones to teach, and how learners can learn them. Even the New York Times Magazine featured an article about chunking in language, which suggests that it is not just an area of interest to specialists, but to curious minds everywhere. This article is one of the preloaded texts at Versatile.pub if you would like to explore its language. The use of the term chunk in this presentation comes from linear unit grammar, a relatively little-known approach to analysing speech as it happens in real time. John Sinclair and Anna Maurinen wrote the book. They say that speech is linear along the dimension of time, and writing is linear along the dimension of space. They also say that humans chunk information. Notice that chunk is a verb here. Somebody chunks something. Each segment of speech is regarded as a chunk, and there are various types of chunks. So when we are reading and listening, we perceive groups of words in chunks. When we are writing and speaking, we produce groups of words in chunks. This is one of our working memory's functions. In terms of learning languages, the use of known chunks makes a very big contribution to our fluency. And using known chunks accurately contributes to making our speech and writing more native-like. Important stuff. Let's take a look at this series of statements about pandas. Each one expresses a message. The structure of each message revolves around a verb. Depending on the grammar pattern of the verb, it may have subjects, objects, complements, and adjuncts expressing how, when, where the verb happened. To make a series of statements into a text, the most usual thing to do is to link the statements with words and phrases that articulate the structure and the author's attitude. And this is exactly what the words at the top here do. Can you find the right place for them? Pause the video if you want to try this. Now we have a text. Not all words and phrases that articulate the structure and the author's attitude start sentences. Language is not so tidy. But the panda text shows precisely the process that John Sinclair and Anna Maurinen wrote about in linear unit grammar. However, their interest did not extend to the written language, as they were exploring the linearity of spoken language, how our speech consists of one chunk after another after another. Let's look at it now as a paradigm. We can see that full text is made up of two types of units of language, that the M language expresses a proposition and the O language articulates attitude or structure. M language is usually a clause which has a verb at its core. Because we have to construct message clauses, they are not chunks in the sense of being prefabricated or ready-made. O language is prefabricated. We pull it from our memories. This is why it qualifies as chunks, by this definition at least. So, only O language consists of chunks. And you can see why Bollinger said that speakers do at least as much remembering as they do putting together. So as we just saw, the message consists of a clause. Its structure depends on how its verb works. Messages often add a phrase which expresses time or manner or place, etc. These are referred to as adjuncts. Adjuncts are like sub-messages or messages about the message, usually an optional extra. It depends on the verb. The verb put, for example, is incomplete without an adjunct. We can't say the child put the toy, or that's precisely where they put the ball, or research into pandas put them. All of those are incomplete without an adjunct. But not just manner, place and time. Adjuncts are used to add these types of semantic information to clauses. They tell us about the verb in the clause. They are often expressed by single words such as now, there, many, but they are more often expressed by prepositional phrases, such as the examples here. Remember that phrases do not contain finite verbs. There are many prepositional phrases in English that occur frequently enough to count as chunks. That is, they are prefabricated and do not require the speaker or writer to construct them. We can task students with identifying these elements and more. Guided discovery of features of language directs their attention to features of language that the students need for all of their skills work. The key nouns and the verbs and adjectives that collocate with them, for example. In the first sentence, problems is the important noun. It is the main new information that the author is giving the reader about pandas, which is the subject of the sentence. We see face problems, serious problems, verb and adjective collocations respectively. Once the students know that messages are structured in this way, they can be tasked with identifying the subject, verb, object, complement, adjunct, and other structures. Focusing on the structure of information in a text whose content is also being studied means learning two things at once, at least. This is much appreciated in ESP, CLIL, and EMI environments. For students to form messages, they learn about grammar and vocabulary. As you can see around the middle of this continuum, there are aspects of language which are a little bit of both or neither one nor the other exactly. In creating messages, our brains are very busy selecting and combining our grammar and vocabulary knowledge with our knowledge of the world, which is where the content of our message comes from. Most of these are labels for one sort of language pattern or another. For example, why did I just use the ing forms selecting and combining after busy? It is a pattern in the language that I have come to know through decades of exposure. In fact, it is a pattern in English that a small set of adjectives are followed by verbs in their ing forms. Fortunately, we don't have to construct everything from scratch. There are many chunks of language that we select and adapt in forming our messages. The mental processes we use to express our orientation to the speaker and to the information itself are very different from those we use in message formation. Because O language is prefabricated, our job is to select the one which is appropriate to the immediate context. And what, you may ask, is meant by context? Thanks especially to Professor Michael Halliday, we can be quite specific about what context refers to. There are two categories of context here: register, which covers field, tenor and mode, and genre, which refers to the social purpose of a text, what the text is doing. A lot of organization and orientation language is used in all contexts, such as common conjunctions. But some is field-specific. The functional language used in STEM subjects differs from those used in the humanities. Some is tenor-specific. We speak to people we know well differently from people we have some social distance from. And some is mode-specific. The O language in an essay is very different from the O language when speaking to somebody, even if the field is the same and maybe even the genre is similar. Discourse markers and conjunctions are types of O language. On the left, we have some very typical examples. On the right, we see some O language that is typical of academic language. You might like to pause and have a look at these. Here, for example, we have the abstract of a research article into the nature of academic writing itself. The underlined words and phrases are all O language. In contrast, tells the reader that the next message differs in some way from the previous one. There are several other orientation examples here. However, in fact, instead, rather, and some organization language too. Firstly, additionally. The highlighted "our goal in the present paper" explicitly introduces their goal, so this is also a form of organization language guiding the reader. Now we know a few things about messages and O language, how we can combine them to make text. Let's now consider their fit in language teaching and learning. You might like to pause the video now and make a list of ways of incorporating this in skills lessons. Try to predict some of the tasks. But before we have a look at some tasks, bear in mind the reasonable expectations that we can make on our students. They can analyze language, make decisions based on data and their criteria, and then create genre-appropriate texts. These invoke higher-order thinking skills. Let's start with a few suggestions for the receptive skills. Here is a task that can be done during a reading lesson. Just add it to your lesson plan. So you have a text. Ask the students to read through it and underline the key words and the words around them that express the key points of the text. You can then discuss that with them to see if there are any differences between your version and their version. And then ask them about the chunks that have not been underlined. With a little bit of prompting, you can then ask them to double underline the chunks that help structure the text, and then wavy underline the chunks that express the author's attitude. By the end, every word in the text should be underlined. If you do this with several texts, they really start to get an idea of how chunky language is. And of course, this can be extended to transcripts of listening texts, which have typically quite different organization language. Choose texts that the students will learn something valuable from. As they explore the message, they will learn the content. One way of focusing on keywords is to process their text with the help of versatext. As they explore O language, they will learn how people in their field express attitude and structure. This is part of becoming a member of your professional community. Once the students are familiar with the text, the teacher can provide activities that raise the students' awareness of O language. In the process, they learn it. For example, the teacher provides all the O language chunks on separate cards. As the students listen to the text again, they put the cards in order. Then they can classify the chunks as structure and attitude. If they are already familiar with the register and genre of the text, they can discuss which chunks are general and which are specific to this text type. Looking for them in a corpus may also be of value. If the text is being used as a model for a speaking activity, the students can be encouraged and expected to use the O language that they have just observed. Let us now task students with working with a text bottom up. That is, starting with the smallest units and building a text. We'll start with words. Can you form a sentence from these words? What are you thinking about? Probably that you've seen this sentence before and you're trying to remember it. And you're looking for words that go together. You identified giant pandas and face problems and face serious problems and in the wild. And then you put them together using your knowledge of English syntax. Jumbling words for students to assemble into sentences and jumbling sentences for students to assemble into a text are well-known activities. They are usually done with everything printed on a page for the students to number and rewrite. However, using cards adds an element of physicality to the activity, and when students rearrange them, they consider the differences between their versions. The cards can be used for other activities that develop collocation and pronunciation, for example. The mental process involves looking for words that go together, i.e. collocations and phrases, and then putting these combinations together according to syntax. Here are the steps for putting a text together from chunks. So the teacher writes out a text with each chunk on a separate card, one set for each group. Then give the students the message cards only for them to put in order as best they can. The teacher prompts the students while monitoring. Check the order, point out or elicit key words, because from one message unit to another in the same text, there are field or domain related words, and keywords are repeated and substituted with pronouns. Then identify the patterns of the verbs. And lastly, give the students the cards with the O language to position as we did with the panda text. When we are note-taking, we typically write the keywords and phrases that we hear and read that we want to remember, and these consist of nouns and other elements of M language. When we want to convert our notes, usually from multiple sources, into another format, we have to put them in some sort of order, and the order may be explicitly expressed using O language. If we are making a presentation, it is mainly M language that appears on the slides, and the speaker guides the audience through the presentation, combining this with a lot of O language. When teachers prepare their students to write essays or give presentations, providing them with the appropriate language helps them do the job better than they would if they had to make it up themselves. It's not a great leap from the previous tasks to speaking and writing. Let's have a look. In preparing students to speak, teachers often elicit key words. On the left we see a simple spray diagram which has some key words about birthdays in general. In addition to the nouns, there are some collocating verbs and adjectives. Similarly, with the picture of the bike labelled richly, not just with its parts, but with verbs that parts do. These collocations are the bases of the messages that the students will construct. On the right, there is a part of a mind map about teachers giving feedback. To turn these messages into speech, the students need to decide on the order of information and then what organization orientation chunks they are going to use. As we know, this will depend on the genre and register of the text. So, are they telling their friends a story about a childhood memory, or something that happened yesterday? or maybe they are explaining to a doctor what happened. One of the important things that teachers provide in speaking and writing lessons is O language relevant to the text type. Here is another type of task that will help students learn about keywords in their field. It is also a bottom-up task. This is not normally how we write, but the activity does follow the mental processes we use when we write and when we speak. In this example, our keyword is spider. Using its collocations, we'll make some simple sentences and add some O language to produce a little text. Skell is probably the best source of collocations in general English. But when ESP or EMI students create word profiles of keywords in their fields, it is better if they use a more specialized corpus. Here are some collocations of spider from an academic biology corpus. You can see the difference. After selecting some collocations, students can write simple factual messages around them. They are learning about the topic and language at the same time. Then, with a little massaging, we created text by adding some structure and attitude words and phrases. And it's also necessary to substitute pronouns for some of the key words. We've looked at a few tasks or task types that students can do to focus on O language to develop their reading, writing, speaking and listening. But let's now look at some specific study techniques that they can use in this connection. When we are reading and listening, we can't always be sure that a string of words whose meaning is quite transparent, unlike idioms, has been created by the author for this particular text, or if they have used a chunk of language that already exists. To find out, look in a corpus. On the right, we have a few examples of chunks with their hits per million in Skell. These may seem like very low numbers, but they certainly indicate that these are frequently occurring chunks. 0.44 means that there are about 440 uses of the chunk in the corpus. Regarding study, students can be encouraged to devote part of their notebooks to storing these chunks as they come across them. They might have pages for different registers and genres or use a code to indicate this. As we saw at the beginning, text, whether spoken or written, occurs in a line, and the line consists of chunks, many of which are prefabricated, especially, though not only, organization and orientation language. John Sinclair and Anna Marinen's linear grammar was developed to explain how spoken language happens in time as a succession of chunks. They did not see it as a framework for teaching the 4 skills and systems. This is my own application of their work. If you are aware of Professor Michael Halliday's textual metafunctions, you might be wondering how they correspond to M&O language. Well, as you can see here, there is a very close correspondence. His ideational corresponds to message, interpersonal to orientation, and textual to organization. His 3 metafunctions also relate to registers, field, tenor, and mode. You can pause the video to read these glosses. At the front of this photo, we see John Sinclair on the left and Michael Halliday on the right, enjoying a pint with some other conference goers. I think we can agree that chunks play an important role in teaching the 4 skills and the 4 systems. Most functional language is organization orientation language, and most organization orientation language is functional language. And we can view the 4 skills in CEFR terms. In addition to reception and production, there is mediation and interaction. When mediating a text, for example explaining what you read to someone, most of the M language will be the same. It is the O language that will be different. To build the teaching of chunks into lessons, bear in mind that the students need to know these things. They need to know what chunks are, why they should know them, how to identify them in text, and how to confirm their status as chunks. They need to know how to recognize the genre and register they're used in, and how to use them when they are speaking and writing. This brings to an end this introduction to the teaching of chunks for the purpose of developing language students' competence in the 4 skills and for improving their learning to learn skills. Thank you.